Dear friends, around 800 years back, the world witnessed such a spiritual movement which was very different from the traditional spirituality of the church. He was a humble man who transformed his world and renewed the church of his day by the simple but revolutionary act of practicing the Christian faith as it had never been practiced before or since. Its impact continues to resonate throughout the ages until the present day. Do you know him?
The man who is known as the second Christ because he lived gospel literally.
The man who wanted to be a brave warrior and ended up being a mendicant.
The first person who received stigmata of Christ.
A man who considered everything in this world as his brother and sister.
A man to whom even animals came to listen about the love of God.
A man who even renounced his clothes for the sake of the gospel.
Yes, he is the greatest saint of all times. We will tell you more about him.
Francis of Assisi was a poor little man who surprised and inspired the church by taking the gospel literally, by actually following all that Jesus said and did joyfully. He is one of the world's most popular and beloved saints. He is also the patron of animals, merchants and ecology.
Francis was born in Assisi, Italy in 1181 to wealthy parents. His father was a silk merchant who nicknamed his son Francis after France, a nation and culture which he admired. Francis enjoyed a comfortable youth and had many friends. Francis himself said he lived in sin during his teenage years.
As a young man, Francis tasted for glory. While setting out to join the Fourth Crusade, God spoke to Francis and told him to return home. Francis was humiliated, but he obeyed. Later, when he was encountered a leper, Francis was moved with compassion and he gave the man a kiss as a sign of peace. After the gesture, the man disappeared. Francis concluded God had been testing him.
The final moment of conversion came when Francis visited a ruined church and heard God ask him to rebuild the church. Francis assumed God wanted him to help the church he was praying in. So he stole clothes and money from his father to do it. Enraged, Francis' father took his son to the bishop and sued him for the money. The bishop ordered Francis to repay the money. Francis responded by renouncing his inheritance and his family and dedicating himself to serving the poor.
Francis took to the streets and lived day to day, relying on God to provide. As he went about, he cared for the sick and the poor. Francis became legendary for his compassion. It is said that he could talk to the animals. Followers flocked to Francis and he established an order of monks. Today, it is the Franciscan order. Francis lived a life so holy, he was canonized just 2 years after his death.
That's all about the life of Saint Francis. Now it's time to analyze some of the key features that made his life and spirituality so appealing.
He practiced what he preached. He was authentic. He lived his faith more than he talked about it. His living example speaks more eloquently than a mountain of books and more forcefully than a lifetime of sermons. Just as he said, preach the gospel at all times and if necessary use words.
He was real. Saint Francis is different from other saints whose life seems to be a religious fairy tale. He was a very ordinary man with ups and downs and spending years in spiritual darkness. He had his feet firmly planted on the ground while his heart soared to heaven.
He was radical. St. Francis was not a mediocre Christian. The divine flame in him burned away all the indifferences in him and sparked a radical and uncompromising faith. He had that intense desire always to follow Christ ever closer.
He was passionate. His religious life was not a collection of dusty rituals and rules. Rather, he did crazy things out of his love for God. His enthusiastic behavior was often embarrassing to himself and his followers. Saint Bonaventure wrote, "He seemed to be completely absorbed by the fire of divine love like a glowing coal."
He gives us hope. Today we see around us a number of factors that hinder the unity and beauty of the Christian life due to cultural changes and controversies. In spite of all this, St. Francis gives us a pure and powerful heartbeat of love that draws us closer to God through his emphasis on innocence, hope, and the positive possibilities of faith in God.
Yes, we have heard sufficiently about St. Francis, and now it's time to look into his spirituality. St. Francis was convinced that to be a Christian was to be like Christ, to follow him in every possible way. He himself declares that humility, simplicity, prayer, and poverty is their vocation. It is upon these foundations that the Franciscan way of life is built. Let us now try to understand in deep these foundational values of the Franciscan spirituality.
Humility of St. Francis of Assisi. St. Francis, like any other saint, was well aware of the power and danger of human pride and condemned it as a spiritual enemy. St. Francis always considered that true joy and real greatness came from striving downward. St. Francis says, "Blessed is the one who would accept correction, accusation, and blame from another as patiently as he would from himself. Blessed is the one who, when he is rebuked, quietly agrees, respectfully submits, humbly admits his fault, and willingly makes amends. Blessed is the one who is not quick to excuse himself and who humbly accepts shame and blame for a sin, even though he did not commit any fault." St. Francis very clearly understood the true humility of Christ, and it sprang up from deep within his heart to imitate the true humility of Christ, and so his life was framed after two episodes of supreme humility of Christ, incarnation and crucifixion. For St. Francis, nothing could give him greater pleasure than to be called in public poor, despised, and simple. He was determined that he and his friars should not only feel humble, but that they should also live humbly. They were to be called friars minor because he wanted them to be subordinate and inferior to all, to live among the outcasts of society, and to be despised. Humility is indeed one of the foundation stones of Franciscan way of life, and Francis was always grateful to anyone who reminded him of this and warned him not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think.
Simplicity. Franciscan simplicity consists, first of all, in a very simple approach to the words of Christ, that is, not trying to adopt it to suit his own convenience and that of his brethren. For instance, Jesus had forbidden his disciples to possess two coats. Francis also expected his brothers to do the same. Another mark of his simplicity of St. Francis was his innocence. He gave whatever he had to those who asked him. In his eyes, there was no distinction
between the deserving and the undeserving poor. He also had a simple faith in the providence of God. St. Francis teaches us simplicity as a grand antidote to a culture of money and madness. It is indeed God's pruning that cuts back the tangled branches of our lives, enabling us to live freely, share generously, and love deeply.
Poverty. St. Francis was poor before God and the world. His poverty was his chosen way of life. It was not a destructive poverty thrust upon people by the circumstance beyond their control. His poverty was a holy poverty, possible only by the surrender of one's possession and oneself to God and for God. St. Francis showed to the world that absolute poverty was something that we could enjoy. And for him, poverty became an idol, a state of bliss to be worked for and paid for. Franciscan spirituality invites us to detach our hearts from property, possessions, and sometimes certain people. Franciscan spirituality invites us to attach our heart to the Lord. St. Francis considered poverty an idol to be worked, firstly because it was a way of life chosen by Christ. He described it a naked to follow the naked Christ. Secondly, it was a form of self-sacrifice, a denial of normal human instinct to offer our lives to God. Thirdly, it made man depend upon God rather than upon themselves, deepening the trust in God. Lastly, it gave other people the opportunity of showing charity to those who had adopted this way of life.
Prayer. Humility and simplicity were states of mind, and poverty was a way of life. The fourth foundation stone of his spirituality was prayer, because he knew well enough that there was no hope of achieving the former without the help of God. His constant and indeed virtually continuous contact with God was that upon which everything else depended. Prayer was his sure refuge in everything that he did, but put his trust in God's loving providence. For him, prayer was not an exercise regulated by schedule. He prayed at every moment through each and every action, both day and night. The prayers and reflections of St. Francis were not based on some books or commentaries, but was spontaneous and personal. He used to remind his disciples, "Brother, body is our cell, and our soul is the hermit who lives in it. If the soul cannot remain quiet in its cell, then a cell made with his hands is a little value to a religious." We know little about the way Francis prayed. His devotions did not normally take the form of set prayers. For much of his praying, words were not necessary.
Saint Francis is a saint of humility, charity and love for all creatures, great and small. He turned his back on worldly wealth to embrace the simple virtues: solitude, humility, creativity, compassion, service and prayer. His joyful meditation and committed practices can help us to incorporate the Franciscan philosophy into our lives, to lead a life of greater simplicity and deeper spirituality. The Franciscan spirituality throughout the ages could be seen as an effort to extract the simplicity and purity of Jesus' life and teaching and to pour them into our daily life. The spirituality of St. Francis is not something added on to Christianity. Perhaps it is the essence of Christianity.